Hi everybody. How's everyone doing? Pretty good? Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to our open book club. This is a law school event. Of course, you're in the law school, and it's put on by the Law, Technology, and Arts program, which is a wonderful program that serves as a hub of research and dialogue around the intersection of law, technology, and the arts. All three of which I think are represented in our discussion today. I also wanted to thank Ada's Technical Books for selling books outside, copies of Rimdi in both hard and soft cover, which just came out. So make sure to grab one of those if you get a chance. As to introductions, I myself am a new law professor here at University of Washington School of Law, and I focus on privacy and also on robotics. And I'm going to be your host and moderator for this evening. And I wanted to also introduce our panelists as well. We're very excited to have an interdisciplinary set of practitioners, scholars, and of course author to explore the theme of today's book, Rimdi. I was actually always curious about this. So how many of you today are not trained or training to be a lawyer? Wow, okay, look at that. Look at that. I love seeing that, right? I love that you guys are here, and I think that's really wonderful, and I just love to have you here as part of this discussion. This is the best response to that question I've ever gotten. Other times it's usually like a third, and I'm very happy with that, but that's an overwhelming number. Okay, so just quick introductions here. So Bethan Cantrell is a privacy and gaming professional. Prior to her current role as a technical privacy lead for a gaming system, she actually worked in online crime prevention education, which may have been useful to Peter if he had gotten that at some point, and as well as online safety. Also with us today is Professor Yoshi Kono. He's a computer science professor here at the University of Washington, and his team has done some really exciting, interesting work revealing privacy and security vulnerabilities, for instance, in home robots or embedded medical devices like pacers or smart cars, showing that you can get information from these things and take them over. Very exciting work, and we're really glad to have you here as well. And then Greg Listoka is a law professor at Rutgers Camden, and he's the author of Virtual Justice, The New Laws of Online Worlds, among other works about law in virtual environments. He's really one of the foremost experts on the law of virtual spaces, and we're really excited to have him here. And he also came all the way from the East Coast and is going to be traveling to where tomorrow?
Manchester, England.
Manchester, England, so after he leaves us. Which, of course, brings me finally to Neal Stephenson. So I'm going to say about Neal what This American Life host Ira Glass said about Joss Whedon, okay? Which is that Neal Stephenson is somebody who either you have no idea who he is or you love him, right? And I think that more and more people fall in that latter category. So he's obviously a best-selling, award-winning author of Snow Crash and Cryptonomicon and Diamond Age and Anthem and many other works. And we're really delighted and grateful to have you here, so thank you very much. And today, of course, we're going to talk about Neal's recent book, Rimdi. I'm not going to do a recap of the book on the assumption that because this is an open book club, you guys have obviously all read it, except for my student Alex. But this is a book that one New York Times critic, who incidentally generally raved about the book, described as thoughtfully nuts when he's talking about the plot of Rimdi. But basically it's about a founder of a video game, Richard Forthras, who is searching for his twice-kidnapped niece Zula across multiple continents, and within his own game called T-Rain. T-Rain is itself a kind of fantasy-themed, massively multiplayer online role-playing game, which is a mouthful. It's kind of like a World of Warcraft, but much smarter. Okay, so I thought we'd start off, and I would just start to ask this panel some questions, and I was going to start with you, Neal. Okay. So there's a lot that I want to ask you about this book, but I'll start with this. So Richard, the protagonist, he's a reformed smuggler who creates a virtual world. Hero, the protagonist of Snow Crash, was a self-created smuggler who reforms a virtual world. And I was wondering what, if any, relationship is there between Snow Crash and Rimdi?
Well, Snow Crash was written very early in the internet. I only had the vaguest idea that there was a thing. I'm pretty sure that at the time I wrote Snow Crash, if you had asked me to define the difference between Ethernet and the internet, I wouldn't have been able to do that. So this was in the era when email systems were balkanized. We had CompuServe and a couple of different sort of local email systems, but they hadn't been joined together yet into one sort of global email system, and the future of that just wasn't clear at all. So Snow Crash was kind of my best guess as to how sort of 3D graphical virtual reality might become a mass medium. And it turned out to be totally wrong. I thought it was going to be like TV, and so the picture of that world that's given in Snow Crash is basically kind of TV-like in a certain sense. And instead what happened was that the kind of driving application for 3D graphics turned out to be video games. And so in ReamD, we're kind of seeing what really happened, which is that video games ended up being the thing that made 3D graphics into a household technology.
Greg and I were talking about some of the similarities between those two characters, and maybe I'll let him ask the question in a moment. One thing I wanted to talk about with respect to ReamD in particular is that it is set in a contemporary context, and it's a contemporary context that is full of constraints. And it's something that we, and many of you are not actually trained in sort of cyber law, but it's many of us that work on cyber law think a lot about constraints, and constraints of different kinds, right? So not just legal constraints, but the constraints of, say, physics. Mm-hmm. So so that, for example, not one set but two sets of characters are constrained by the physics of gas consumption and wind, right? Marlin in the boat and Shangor, and then Jones's jet. Software, of course, acts as a kind of constraint, and it empowers characters in terrain, but also beyond. So, for instance, Marlin's encryption of Wallace's hard drive is a constraint imposed by code, one that has consequences and resulting in economic loss and in death, in one case. And then human nature is itself constraining, so that you have the Sokolov's obligations towards Zula and the like. Arguably one of the only constraints that's missing in this book is the constraint of law on human behavior. And so I just wanted to ask you to comment on the role of constraint in ReamD, if you would.
Sure. When I was a kid, I used to read thrillers by Alistair MacLean. So he wrote Where Eagles Dare and Guns of Navarone. He was just a great thriller writer and produced these really kind of workmanlike thrillers that contain scenes and events in them that stuck with me. There's a sort of great cable car scene or not cable, but a tram scene in Where Eagles Dare, for example. So, and what thriller writers are doing is they're making sort of artful use of constraints to tell an interesting story. So you're on a cable car. There's only one way down that's not fatal. How are you going to handle that? And so that's kind of the name of the game in writing thrillers. And what I wanted to do in the case of ReamD was to sort of write a new thriller that what I was aspiring to do was to sort of make it at least as engaging as the MacLean thrillers I used to read when I was a kid. But with a different set of constraints driving it. So there's a kind of familiar set of constraints that we see in traditional thrillers, such as people get lost, they don't know where they are, or people can't reach, they can't communicate. The phone goes dead or something like that, or they can't get some crucial piece of information. And then there's other ways in which people are very unconstrained. So if you want to get away, you can sort of disappear into the crowd or something. And in a way, a lot of that's been flipped around and isn't applicable anymore. So we're all accustomed now to being able to Google, get any kind of information we want, being able to pick up our mobiles and call people all over the world whenever we need it, and know our exact coordinates on a map. At the same time, dissolving into the crowd isn't really an option anymore. You know, there's surveillance cameras all over the place. So I was trying to see if an interesting story could be written that reflected the new set of constraints and sort of non-constraints that we live in today. And part of what I did in order to achieve that was to go to China, because that's a place where there's kind of ubiquitous surveillance of everything. You can't really, if you're particularly if you're a Westerner in China, you know, dissolving into the crowd is not an option. And everything that you do is going to be witnessed by a lot of humans and a lot of cameras. And so I just thought that that would make kind of fertile ground for a new type of thriller with a new set of constraints.
On the question of not being able to sort of blend in and having sort of total visibility, obviously the gaming environment is one in which, in theory, depending on how it's architected, you could know everything about what people do. And in fact, Richard and his team, they do. They do
and they don't.
They do and they don't, right? So I mean, what don't they know? What do they know?
Yeah.
In some ways they know everything, in some ways they know nothing, right?
Right. Yeah, they can do a sort of database search and find out everything that a particular character has done in that world, but they don't know who that person is. They don't know where in the physical world that player happens to be or what the identity of that player is. So what I was trying to do in this book was to create an interesting story by juxtaposing those two things against each other.
But it's not the case that they have sort of zero information about where a person is, for instance, right? Because there's all these weird linkages between, say, your IP address and where you might be, and then of course we see that, yeah.
Yeah, so you can make an educated guess about where somebody's dialing in from, or dialing is not the right word to use, showing my age, where a person's logged in from based on their global IP address. But if that location happens to be, you know, a city of 8 million people in China, then, well, you've narrowed it down some, but you still have an interesting time ahead of you figuring out exactly who that person is.
Actually, maybe I'll spring in Bethan on this, but if obviously the way that T-Rain's architecture ends up mattering a lot because it permits even off to zero in on Marlin, but only at a particular time, and only after a lot of sort of due diligence. And yet Marlin is able to launch ReamD because of the relative anonymity that the architecture of T-Rain affords him. And so I guess I was just going to ask you, having a background here in this, presumably it's possible to build a system with zero anonymity or complete anonymity. And what are some of the considerations that go into those things?
So one of the principal privacy guidelines that we kind of follow is least collection. So you have something you want to build, and what is it that you need to collect from the customer in order to build that thing? And then you collect the least amount of it. And then people like me come along, and on the back end we say, okay, how can we make this data as useless as possible? So that all of the needs of the service or the game can be met without creating this really robust set of data about the customer that can be used for secondary purposes. So sometimes secondary purposes are okay. A secondary purpose would be querying it so that I can find out what Marlin is doing, where Marlin lives, things like that. The purpose of collecting the data is so that Marlin can play the game, and maybe so that if Marlin has a bad experience, he can call customer service and complain, and customer service can do something to make Marlin feel better. The purpose is not to query it so that you can go and find Marlin and say, Marlin, what are you doing? I mean, unless you've got enforcement, and then of course you want to do so there's all of those kinds of things to consider. But the main one is least collection. You can architect for true anonymity if you don't want to have any customer service or enforcement on the background. If you want to have customer service or enforcement, then you have to have some method of identifying who that person is at least enough that you can shut off their access to the system.
So it's interesting. So it's too bad that you didn't work for Corporation 9592, right? Because in a way, it feels like Richard's way that he's architected the system, he grants anonymity to allow for the participation of, say, Chinese teenagers because they contribute to the economic vitality of the space. Did you think at all, Neal, about sort of Richard's motivations being good motivations or bad motivations? I mean, this is a theme of good and evil that comes up sort of again and again in the piece.
Well, I mean, what we're trying to set up with Richard is this idea that he's coming out of a pretty amoral background as a smuggler, and he's not inherently the kind of person who's going to be terribly concerned with sort of ethical niceties. He just wants the system to work, but he knows that it's going to work better if the people who use it feel a certain sense of security and anonymity behind which they're safe. So he's going to, I mean, I didn't work this out in complete detail, but I would say he would have worked the system out in such a way as to achieve that goal. And then lots of other people would have come in his wake. So the people who got hired to build it would have been worried about the kinds of things that Dutton's talking about, and would probably see him as a kind of sacred monster in the organization, sort of smart and charismatic, but lacking in sort of any particular moral compass. So these people would come along and try to set things up in a way that would avoid getting them in trouble, and that's kind of shown in the fact that when Zula is compelled to sort of find the creator of the virus, to find Marlin, she has to sort of pull some strings and get access to some information that normally wouldn't be given out.
Right. I remember when Google ended up having to fire an employee on Gmail because that particular employee was looking at people's Gmails and then contacting them on that basis. And so it may be possible always for somebody in one position to do it. But on this theme of good and evil and sort of Richard's background, it's just so interesting to me that Richard, the way that he distinguishes T-Rain from, say, a World of Warcraft is by this sort of hyper-realism, right? So it's like you have a whole physics to it, and it actually, the currency actually develops at a rate that it would in the natural world. And yet, when it comes, and there's this whole narrative arc, and there's all this time devoted to sort of explaining the story, and yet when it comes down to the central conflict, it turns out to be between good and evil. And that, of course, is something that participants, don't buy into, right? And they come up with their alternative scenario. I mean, and meanwhile, I don't know that there's one character in Reamd that could be said to be sort of purely good or purely evil. Was that conscious on your part, or I mean, what role? I guess I've always wanted to know what role does the conflict between the brightness and the Earth Tone Coalition play in your mind?
Well, it's kind of I mean, it's almost a little bit of an in-joke from Dungeons and Dragons. D&D is the basis of all of these games. They're all just basically some minor permutations on Dungeons and Dragons. And one of the, back in the day, if you were starting a Dungeons and Dragons character, you would sort of have to make the decision: are they going to be good, evil, or chaotic? And which sounds really important, but in fact, there was sort of no real difference. I mean, there may have been some difference in terms of like what spells you could cast or what you were allowed to do, but there was no actual conflict going on in that world between good and evil per se. So it was all just kind of pasted on, just some labels. And so what's happening in this story is basically that the vast kind of gamer audience that plays this game is calling bullshit on that whole thing. They're just saying there's no good and evil. it's ridiculous. We're just going to form sort of two different factions based on taste. And so based on a kind of intuitively held sort of sense of who belongs to which group, and we're going to fight it out over that, and we don't care what your sort of top-down classification system is.
So that's sort of an example of participants in a virtual environment taking matters into their own hands and asserting control over that environment. I was actually going to bring Greg in to answer a question about, what sort of laws govern this. So, right, so imagine for a moment that that Richard's efforts to shore up the Earth Tone Coalition, using a meteor spell that just takes out enormous groups of the enemy. But in doing so, takes out a bunch of totally lawful and, in fact, invited economic activity, right? So it's not like REAMD where it's a crime. It's like literally someone is putting a lot of time and effort into making money here. And then some founder comes in and uses his ultra-powerful character to sort of put his thumb, and in doing so, displaces all this economic activity. So what? Or is there any way that these people could respond?
Well, what's really interesting about the book is that most everything that Neal describes is stuff that's actually happening right now. I mean, it's so Second Life, is a platform where there is a purchase of real virtual currencies for real money, and there is cashing out of the virtual currency back into real money, and there are businesses on that platform. And certainly, I mean, the World of Warcraft is explicitly discussed in the book, and there are gold farming operations in China where people are working, 24/7 trying to acquire gold, and that's a business, for them, just like Marlon's, business. And what happens in some cases is the game company will say your account is banned, and then poof, all of that investment suddenly vanishes.
And that's a risk that they're just going to take? And
that's a risk that the gold farmers will take because, they stand to get a profit off of it. If they can avoid detection and sell the loot before, it gets tracked down, then they can turn their profit and keep on playing the game. The interesting thing that Neal does is this APIS system. I thought that was really clever because, so Richard's use of the goblin, going through the wrong way on the airport security detection scheme and tying in terrain with all of these kind of real-world monitoring activities. And Neal is so it's interesting because you say that, well, this is all marketing and it's nonsense, right? But then other people do things. What I think is exactly right. You create this new idea about a technology, and then innovators will come in and actually build real working financial models on top of that. So your question would be, you have actually an APIS-based real business making real money in terrain, and a meteor comes and just destroys that business. I think the answer would be the terms of service, right? The terms of service would say, you assume all risk when you operate on the terrain platform, and if the company wanted to, protest that suddenly they were destroyed by a meteor, I think what would happen probably is Richard's company would say, look at the terms of service, and then they might actually, given that they have control over the environment, reboot the backup servers and put back their stuff. But I don't think there would be a cognizable legal claim based upon that sort of risk that seems inherent in the environment. It's kind of like an earthquake, destroying a real company.
Is it? Because, I don't know. I don't have that intuition. I don't know if you guys have that intuition. My intuition is that the big difference here, and I don't know what your intuition is the fact that you built it on purpose to facilitate economic activity in a way that World of Warcraft doesn't. That's its competitive differentiating point. And the idea that you could use some lawyerly language in order to disabuse anyone of the notion that they could possibly rely upon that strikes me as amazing. Is it really? Do you really think that courts would just in every instance?
I really think a business-to-business transaction, and that's spelled out in the contract, and they signed it, and they say, it can be destroyed at any time. I think that would hold up. Yeah.
Even if it's as arbitrary as one of the demigods in the environment deciding.
But it would never get to that point because cooler heads would, somebody like Richard would come in and say, fine, I understand the legal argument, but we're going to lose business if we do this. People are going to hate us. We can't have that.
Yeah. And then Corvallis would probably figure it out, right? Do something technical.
So other forces like market forces would intervene, or these other human constraints. And
I mean, part of what you're buying into if you're in this line of work is that you're having to be aware of the effects that your actions can have on the social media universe. You need to be really clever about how you respond to those kinds of problems. You do not want to come off as the unhip, clueless jerk who doesn't get it.
especially when money is on the line, it feels like that people would be particularly sensitive. So what are your intuitions, Neal, about the fact that this virtual environment makes REAMD possible, right? So it's, I mean, the virus, it seems, really couldn't have worked without the architecture that Richard puts and his company puts in place. Do they bear any responsibility, in your view, for making this possible?
Well, it's one of these things where it's sort of the law of unintended consequences that always comes around to get you, no matter what you do, what kind of system you create on the internet. You know, somebody is going to figure out some clever hack, some clever way to do something with it, and most of the time it might not amount to anything, but every so often it'll become huge. And so this is one of those, and we've seen that happen a lot on the internet, and we'll see it more in the future. And I think it's just a sort of risk that one accepts in doing business there. So, part of what's going on in this book is that we're seeing Richard as a guy who's been through some rough and tumble things in his life. He's kind of been relegated to a kind of ceremonial position in this company for a while because nobody knows what to do with him. But when this crisis happens, that's when he suddenly becomes the person everyone looks to for answers, because he's got this sort of morally ambiguous, complicated background. He's the only person who can really kind of deal with something this weird.
So I want to bring in Yoshi here and talk a little bit about the technologies that have been deployed by the various parties of it. So there is, of course, this computer virus. Then there are these very sophisticated tracking techniques that are being used, by whether it's the English intelligence or it is. So I guess my question for you is, so what are you seeing right now as sort of the cutting edge and emerging threats, and how common is it for a new platform to emerge, like in this case T-RAIN with certain characteristics, that allows for an attack that was never possible before, and how do people react to that?
I think that's a very good question. I think I might back up a little bit and describe what RIMD does for people that haven't actually read the book. It's a virus that spreads, from people's computers. Once you're infected with it, it will take your hard drive or a portion of your hard drive, encrypt it with a key that only it knows, and then they keep a copy of the key, and they say, well, if you want to have access to this data again, you need to transfer us some money. And the way they actually handle transferring this money is through the T-RAIN game, as opposed to a credit card payment or any other type of payment system. And so with respect to the evolution of bad guys and the kind of the economics of crime on the internet, I think that anytime there is a new platform out there, adversaries might try to think, well, is there some way for me to monetize this? And there's a number of reasons why they might do this. The first reason is that existing systems, people have already poked at it quite a bit, people have tried to monetize it quite a bit, and the potential holes, lots of times people have already started to plug. But you have new systems coming online, the designers of those systems may not have necessarily thought about all the top types of attacks that someone might use with that system, and then someone can think of something clever. In this particular case, I think that was a very clever idea to actually transfer the money within the game.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
No, I thought it was very cool.
Well, because as you kind of intimated, the normal difficulty with ransomware if you're the bad guy is how do you get the money? You need
Yep.
to be you need to be able to do anonymous transfers of money, and you need to be able to process them on an enormous scale. It's not going to be one big score, it's going to be many, many small scores. So how do you create a system for doing that?
Yeah. No, I think it is very clever. And back to your main point, I do think that when new technologies arrive, adversaries will start trying to see, is there a way to make money with it?
Well, I wanted to open up the floor to you all to ask any questions that you have of Neal. I know, in corresponding with you independently, each of you had a bunch of things that you wanted to find out yourself from the author. So I wanted to open, it up to you to ask any questions that you might have at this time before opening it up, of course, to the audience as well. Any questions, Greg, that you have?
Oh yeah, lots actually, but I'll try to be judicious. Richard's the character of Richard. We talked about the constraints. The thing that really struck me about the book was this fascinating, kind of. In a way, it reminds me of Snow Crash because of the themes of the virtual, but Richard is a much more mature character than Hero in some ways, and he's embedded in this family structure. When you talk about constraints on him, the constraints of family seem to loom particularly large, and I'm wondering, like, in some theories of authorship, they say that we break apart the author self into separate components. And I was wondering if, are there is that potentially true of what's happening with Reamdy? Is Richard, in a way, an evolution of where Hero was, or were you thinking of it that way at all?
Well, I think from an authorial point of view, this is one of the hardest things to deal with, and so it tends to come along later. So I think that early in one's career, it's easiest to have your protagonist be an orphan with no kids or girlfriend or boyfriend, and they just run around and do stuff. And there are actually a lot of characters like that in literature, especially kind of in thriller type adventure literature, because weaving somebody into a particular kind of family tapestry is hard. It's a complicated thing, and it does introduce constraints on their behavior and complications that consume a lot of cycles in the author's brain. So on the other hand, from the point of view of what I was trying to do with this book, which was to write a thriller that would be kind of interesting and kind of real. I feel like it's a dead end to use characters who could only exist in thrillers. So there's a certain type of character that shows up in thriller books that is completely rootless, and yet possesses incredible skills with firearms and martial arts and computer hacking, and so that's easy. That's easy, and so it's more interesting to write about somebody who is constantly worrying about family issues. I mean, right now, I think the preeminent example of this is Walter White in Breaking Bad, who's this person who's, in one sense, kind of he's living in a thriller world, making high-tech drugs and engaged in organized crime, but he's constantly having to deal with all these family complications. The cell phone rings at the worst possible time. So I guess it's just sort of building in somebody who's got more realistic kind of family life, personal life is just a challenge that feels worth taking on at a certain point in one's career.
I have other questions, Bill.
Yeah, so I guess I might ask, I have a number of questions, and fortunately have a notebook to help me remind me of them. But one of the things that I really liked about reading the book, so as Ryan mentioned, I'm a computer scientist. My area is particularly computer security. And one of the things that I particularly enjoyed about reading the book is that, every once in a while I'd see these nuggets related to computer security research that, I might know a lot about or might know a little bit about, but is still research that we see being done either actively within the academic computer security community or within the kind of the black hat security community. And I guess my question to Neal was along the lines of, how do you go about writing this book in terms of paying attention to the technology? I'm trying to figure out the role that the technology had in your creation of the plot, in the sense of you see all these things happening in the security community, whether it's identity systems like Tor or steganographic systems or ransomware and so on. Does that kind of feed into the creation of the plot, or do you have a kind of an idea of a plot and then pick out the nuggets that you've known from the technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to pay some attention, but not too much attention to what's really going on, and look for examples that jump out as being particularly interesting. So one of the things that sort of launched this book quite a few years ago was the case of the Filipino, I think it was like a 14-year-old Filipino kid in Manila who created a virus that just went nuts all over the world. I can't remember which one it was, over the course of a few days. And he became a kind of global celebrity out of nowhere because he had written this incredibly effective virus. And so one learns to look for events like that they're based in some kind of interesting technical phenomenon, but they have effects that are easily understood even by non-technical people. Right? So a lot of what one talks about in the computer security world is pretty recondite mathematical goings on, and it's kind of hard to explain it. But anyone can understand sort of having their computer rooted and losing all their data. And so this is one of those. This is a case where the virus happens to infect a computer that's owned by a person whose data is very important to him and who really takes personal offense at it when this happens. And so situations like that are good for taking what might be hard to understand technical events and making them understandable and real to a more general audience, I guess.
No, I think that's a very helpful answer. I guess may I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So actually, I don't know how long it takes to write one of these books. I presume it takes a significant amount of time. And I'm just curious, as you write them, are you kind of nervous that some of the creative ideas that you've come up with are actually going to manifest in the real world and they kind of lose the punch from the book, or do you see, do you see some of the ideas that you've come up with actually materialize?
Yeah, I used to be a lot more nervous about that, now I'm a little more relaxed. I mean, even if if something like that does happen, then it's just more kind of validation in a certain way.
Yeah.
Can I jump on Bitcoin? Were you thinking about Bitcoin when you thought about that?
No, see, Bitcoin. I became aware of Bitcoin after the principal photography was complete for this book, as it were.
It's a wonderful description of the way that he sets up the economy. It's almost exactly the same thing, cycles in order to build the stability.
Well, yeah, building in constraints, mathematical constraints, so that you can only produce money so fast. Yeah. Well, but in a sense, that's kind of the essence of any currency, right? So if you can just print money, then the money's worthless, right? So that's kind of self-evident idea.
Great.
I have a question. Ryan and I were discussing it actually earlier over cocktails in the cocktail hour. And in a lot of your books, you have this theme of privatization of street management in cities. And and lots of things. And for me, when I think of that, I think of like libertarian concepts in government and the right to be left alone and things like that. And I'm wondering, when you're along that same trend, when you're looking at these societies where corporations own the stuff that they generate or they own the stuff that they control and they kind of divvy out the rights to it, who do you see owning data? Who would own the data that people are generating when they're traveling through those systems, or when they're being an identity within those systems? Does the individual own it, or does the corporation that's causing it to be generated?
I mean, ideally, how should it be, or how is it going to be, or
I guess what do you have a concept of that when you're creating those societies?
Yeah, I mean,
I know it's a huge subject, so.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, I'm trying to tell a good story, so it's sort of. Unfortunately, the answer really is whatever makes a good story, you know. So, and typically, what makes a good story is whatever scares the hell out of people. And so from my point of view, trying to write a story that people are going to get into, I'm much more drawn to scenarios that are fascinating to people because it preys on sort of deeply concealed fears about what the internet is doing to us, or what have you. So you know, given the choice, I'll always go for something like that, and you can see it. This kind of worry or concern is really out in the open right now. I mean, everyone's on Facebook all the time, and yet at the same time that they're Facebooking, they're sort of nervous about, they're sort of making these nervous little jokes about, you know, who's seeing this and how is this data being used by a weird, mysterious corporation somewhere. And so to me, that looks like an opportunity to tell a scary story about something. That's not to be confused with how I think it ought to be. But I think that in this case, a writer can perform maybe a socially useful role by surfacing certain fears and really making the boogeyman jump out of the closet and scare the hell out of everybody. And then it gives that concern or that anxiety a certain name and face that people can then talk about. So I think that's always been what writers do. I think, 50,000 years ago, when people were sitting around campfires telling stories, that was what writers were doing. So naming the scary thing so people could talk about it.
As a follow-up to that, in terms of the scary thing, I mean, we haven't talked much about the character of Jones and the role of global terrorism. One way to understand Richard's brothers, who live in this society that is somewhat technophobic in a sense, somewhat certainly gun-toting, isolated. You could read it in many ways as a sort of vindication of that decision about lifestyles, insofar as they're actually in a position to deal with this terrorist threat. Were you exploring that at all in the book? Were you sort of thinking through, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean no one's out to get me, as a theme? Yeah.
Well, again, I found it kind of an interesting way to be useful as a writer is to talk about things that people aren't talking about. And so it is a fact that this is a society in which a lot of people own guns, and some of them are quite open about it and like to talk about it and like to be very kind of proud and open about their status as armed people. And then there's a lot of people who just have gun in the closet or in the safe down in the basement or whatever that they inherited or that they got when they were younger. And so this is, but there's a kind of cultural divide in the country, I think. It sort of roughly falls along the red-blue divide around this topic. And I find that kind of interesting. And one of the interesting manifestations of it is kind of blue state people who have guns but never talk about it because they know it's kind of unacceptable, sort of a hidden thing. And so that seems like a kind of raw nerve ending that I couldn't resist poking at in this book. And this was one way to do it, I guess.
But I mean, speaking of guns, there's also just an unbelievable amount of detail about weaponry. I mean, you know, the guns are just gone into in such incredible detail in the book that can't be coincidental. Did you doing a lot of research about guns? Did you just know about it? I mean,
well,
it's incredible. I'm not asking if you have one.
I mean,
On yours right now.
So this is an example of what I was talking about. So to some people, it seems like he goes on and on and on about these different guns. It seems like way too much about that. And then there's other people who read it and say, totally got that wrong. You know, that's not. So, as an example, I used the term clip as a synonym for magazine. A clip and a magazine are totally different things. And so I heard from a lot of people that I got many, many very detailed, clear, rational, controlled, sort of disappointed, but not furious emails about explaining patiently the difference between a clip and a magazine. So I think that part of what one does in a thriller, and let's remember that what I'm doing here is very consciously trying to write a thriller. Again, sort of, you know, this is my sort of maybe the one time in my career I'm going to try to channel Alistair MacLean, is that the hardware matters, and so it's necessary to kind of get that right. And there's it happens a lot in movies or sort of thrillery type, sort of in the imaginary thriller universe where certain books and movies happen, that weapons are just used as a kind of magic problem-solving technique by writers, and it doesn't ring true when one fails to sort of account for the technical details of how they work. A sort of cheap, sleazy trick that I've used over and over again in my career to draw people into a story is to talk about nitty-gritty technical details. Because when you see that, when you're reading along and you see this kind of detailed explanation of how something works, how the ignition on a car works or whatever, if you're a certain kind of reader, it sort of draws you in and makes you say, yeah, okay, this is real, this is really going on. And so, since it's a thriller and guns are important, I put a lot of that in.
I mean, so I just want to push back a tiny bit here, and then I know you have a couple other questions. It's that, you know, I'm an educator. You know, majority, I guess, of panelists here are educators. My mother was an educator, my father was an educator, etc. I just feel like the level of research and detail that you go into, it couldn't just be a function of making it feel real. And there's got to be a pedagogic function in some of your work, I feel. I mean, so for instance, in Snow Crash, the interesting weapon is a play on the last argument of kings being violence. Anathema is a great example of this. I mean, I can't tell you how much I learned about quantum physics, for instance, in reading that book. So, I mean, do you feel at all, are you really just writing a thriller that is accurate, or do you feel like you have a pedagogic function in it?
Well, there's I was living in the DC era in the late 1980s. To the point now where I have to really work to get my decades straight. This was during the heyday of Tom Clancy, and the number of books that he was selling was just unbelievable. And someone made the point that if you're sort of mid-GS level Washington government functionary riding the metro to work in the morning, reading a novel, there's a sense in which reading arty novels is viewed as a waste of time. So highly suspect kind of behavior. But when you're reading a Tom Clancy novel, you're learning something, because he's teaching you about you know how much thrust is delivered by the engines on an F-18 Hornet, you know, and how much fuel it consumes when it's on afterburner, and the caliber of it. There's all this sort of technical detail in those books that, to a literary reader, seems just bizarre. It just, why is this in here? But to a lot of readers, it makes them feel like they're learning something. And so when you're sitting there reading that book on the metro, you're not just being entertained, you're actually learning something. And so without wanting to emulate Tom Clancy in every way, I do think that there's something to that, in the sense that people enjoy reading novels when they have a sense that they're not just being entertained, but kind of picking up some interesting information about the world as they go. And telling stories, I mean, there's an interesting thing about history, which is that a lot of people, when they're students, hate history class, and then later on, when they're adults, they love to read history books. And it's because the way history is taught in school is essentially not through narratives, but through a different kind of structure. Whereas once you get out of school, you're allowed to just read books that tell historical stories in a narrative form that's entertaining and fun.
All right. Well, I wanted to offer you guys any opportunities to ask any other questions that you have.
I do have one more.
Yeah, please.
I'll limit myself to one more. So maybe a brief comment before I dive into the question is that, I really love the balance between both the technical world and the physical world in this book, and I thought that was really good. But for a purpose my question with that, because I'm going to ask a question about the technology, because obviously I'm from the computer science department. I know a bunch of people here are from that department as well. I imagine that as over the course of creating something like this, there are many, many ideas that you come up with that you thought would be great or very interesting from either technological perspective or some other perspective that weren't able to include. And I don't necessarily want you to give away anything that you want to keep for a future book. But if there are some ideas, I'm very curious if there are some ideas of things that just that you really wanted to talk about from a technological perspective or any other perspective actually, but just weren't able to fit in.
Into this one, well, I mean, not so much this one, because it's a more focused book, but I mean, this does happen, and I've actually got I'm involved in a project now called Hieroglyph, which is a project to make kind of optimistic science fiction, because I've written so much pessimistic science fiction. I feel there's no farther I can go in that department. So we're trying to write, trying to create an anthology in which the contributors will write science fiction stories about sort of interesting things that we could build today if we decided to do it. And so my contribution is going to be about a steel tower 20 kilometers high. So far I've only gotten the engineer to sign off on 15 kilometers, but I'm trying to give him pep talks and work him up to 20. So that's going to be a kind of repository for ideas of that type, not only from me, but hopefully from a number of other.
Greg, how much, I mean, I'm just curious about, because you write so much about virtual worlds, I mean, do you end up reading a lot of science fiction as a way to generate ideas about what you write about in your scholarship?
Not, I mean, like there's enough to keep me busy with the real world at this moment. But I mean, what I find interesting about, for instance, Snow Crash is that, and a lot of science fiction is exactly this, in that Second Life, the creators of Second Life, the virtual world that I said is, basically a lot like what we're talking about here. They were inspired by Snow Crash. They said, we want to create the metaverse as it existed in Snow Crash. And the term avatar, a lot of people use that term because of Snow Crash. So, so I think it is really, telling that a lot of the, engineering accomplishments are people trying to fulfill the dreams of science fiction to some extent. So I think that's an important project. Can I ask a question?
Oh, of course, yeah.
So I thought one thing that was really interesting in this book was the D-squared Skeletor examples of science fiction backstory, hack writing in a way, and the contrast between like a deep world building, it's kind of Tolkien-esque, getting into the linguistics versus churning out the novels, and they're both blindsided to a certain extent by the fact that the player population decides to do something completely different that doesn't jive with the backstory. And I know that you're currently involved in some interactive media projects and kind of new media approaches, and I was wondering, if, and as a writer, I think you're kind of positioned in a way outside in some ways of some of the stereotypical aspects of the science fiction genre. Was there a commentary there? Do you see that there's something happening with regard to this? Your initial comment was that you thought this would be, to a certain extent, the metaverse would be like television.
Yeah.
But you're saying it's more like a game.
Yeah.
Does the ludic approach towards culture herald something different for writing and narrative in the future?
I mean, both of those writers in the book are essentially self-parody. Okay, so just to be clear, they're both like they're the angel and the devil that sit on my shoulders all day long. And the only thing they have in common is that they tend to write at great length. But there's there is I won't say it's a new thing because it's been around for a while, but mega fiction is a term that I heard from George R.R. Martin. I don't know if he coined it, but maybe he did. But it's sort of the idea of just fiction that's just enormously long and complicated, and that kind of overspills the boundaries of sort of the conventional book, and the common arena for this is sort of the world of speculative fiction. There are many examples of it. The Harry Potter novels, 7 volumes, which got to be pretty long volumes toward the end, and all of them, I found totally engaging. I mean, I never had any sense of, oh God, when is this going to end? I always, it's just the same with George's stuff. So those two writers in the book are sort of my attempt at making wry comment about the existence of sort of mega fiction in the world and how it gets manifested, sort of at the top and the bottom of the scale of the continuum of literary respectability.
I wonder, Bethan, do you feel as a person who works in this industry, is there a real, when you make decisions that are compliance decisions or decisions that are about dealing with complaints, do you think about the narrative much in your day-to-day of the game that you're working on?
I think about the culture of the gamer and their level. Like some games are much more skill-based. Some games are purely enjoyable. Some games are targeted towards children. Some are targeted towards mature audiences. So I think about what their level of comprehension is based on who's portrayed by like the primary consumer. I think a lot about the people that I drink beers with from the EFF. What story am I going to tell them about the decisions that I'm making? How would I rationalize this? How would I rationalize this? Because I know that there's some technologies that are so complex that you have to make that story so simple, and the user interface that you give to the customer, the privacy statement, the terms of service or the terms of use, those are all of the ways that we tell the story so that the customer can understand it. But for the most part, the internal narrative or the target audience are the primary ways that we rationalize.
Because the narrative plugs into the marketing, which then determines to some extent who your user base is going to be.
Typically, when you're working on a project that's a specific project, a specific game or a service, you already know who you want your consumer to be, and so you work backwards from that. If it's something socially based but targeted towards children, then you've got a more complex narrative that you want to deliver to parents, but you want to make them appealing towards children. If it's something that is not socially based but it's very like skills based, where Halo gamers want to play with themselves, or I don't know, Red Dead Redemption, or these different kinds of titles that you play in different kinds of environments, and what is that environment, and how does that translate to what the customer expectations about data exchange are going to be? Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
I just usually talk to privacy geeks all day long, or security geeks all day long. So.
No, it makes perfect sense. Well, I definitely want to get a chance for everybody to get in. I just want to ask one more question, then, and then we're going to go to audience questions, unless other ones come up organically here. I guess, I really would like to understand, Neal and others, would you want to play Terrain, and why? And did you design a game that you would want to play? And was it a commentary on the existing games that are out there?
Yeah, no, it's wish fulfillment in a certain way. It's something. It's kind of the game I always wanted to build or to have. Having said that, the primary feature of these games is they are addictive, and they're very carefully engineered to be addictive. And so there's only so much time. I mean, if the perfect game came up, I would just play that until I died, probably.
Sorry.
No, that's.
Can we ask questions amongst ourselves too?
Yeah, of course.
So I think that the question about is this a game you like to create would be interesting. I think Bethan's comment about drinking beers with EFF people is a good comment too.
That's the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They're a civil rights group out of California.
They're the kinds of people who would be hardest on Bethan about the privacy ramifications of it.
I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts. Like if the authors of T-Rain had to be accountable for the EFF, how the system would the system look this way? Would it look somewhat different, or what do you think?
If Marcia Hoffman, was calling, or Kurt Apostle, what would they say about T-Rain?
Well, I would need to see the user interface before I made the final call. However, the fact is that as adults, especially when you go into a game, you need to make decisions for yourself. So I read privacy statements, and I actually bookmark terms of service for the stuff that I use a lot, so that I can go and read it if something comes up that doesn't seem right. I go and make a scan for it, and I see, does this make sense? Do those two things make sense with each other, or am I seeing something that might be a flaw in the system? And early on in the internet, you saw a lot of things where they didn't quite tie together because people hadn't quite figured out how to make the privacy statements and the terms of use and the user interfaces and the agreements all kind of come together. I think T-Rain is like a really cool game. And I think that as long as you're going into it as an adult and you're aware that microtransactions happen in a certain way, cool, it seems like a pretty legitimate system. Actually, I was wondering how much research you did on that, because, there's all the timestamps. Yeah.
Not that much.
Good. All right. Well, I definitely want to give people out there a chance to ask some questions of our panelists, and so I'm hoping that you can approach the. We're actually we're recording this, I should say. Speaking of terms of service and privacy, we're recording this, and so it is totally conceivable that if whatever question you ask, people could hear it. But in light of that, we'd also like for you to come up to the mic and ask your questions and maybe queue up. And we'll take a few and then we'll call it a day. But please, by all means, just maybe start over here and then
Sure.
go. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you for devoting your brain cycles to authorship and not to actually executing on these smuggling and cybersecurity ideas you have. My question for you is about suspension of disbelief and internal consistency. I think that a lot of us here are very literal, scrutinizing minds. People are criticizing you for using clip instead of magazine or magazine instead of clip. What's your own bar for building a world that is either very real, like ReamD, or not real at all, in terms of how much scrutiny it can stand up to?
Well, the basic thing that all fantasy and science fiction writers are doing is world building. So the fundamental difference between sort of fantasy and science fiction versus other kinds of fiction is that fantasy SF takes place in alternative worlds that are in some sense more developed than what you see on the page. And those worlds are judged pretty scrupulously by their fans according to how internally consistent they are. That is a crucial feature of any of this kind of fiction, and that's how we get judged. The one kind of loophole in this case is that people sort of understand that in a written story you can do anything you want, but that in a game you're subject to constraints on processing power and sort of what software and hardware are capable of doing. And so there's a kind of agreement, I think, between the people who make these games and the people who consume them, that the consumers aren't going to be too picky. And so if you're playing Halo and you find that you just can't go in a certain direction, you understand it's because they can't actually make an entire planet. And so there's just this tacit understanding between you and the people who make Halo that you're just not going to complain about that. You're just going to turn around and go back the other way and kill some more aliens.
Hi, I have a question for the panel in general. Earlier there was a discussion about, a company building a game like T-Rain where people are actually running businesses inside it, and what sort of responsibility they would have to these business people. And obviously the conclusion was that the terms of service is used as a way to protect the company against any occurrences. But it occurred to me that while protecting the company, this could also potentially, cause them to lose potential revenue. I mean, for every Marlin out there's probably 10 entrepreneurs not willing to take the risks involved in. So I was wondering, do any of you see a future where companies are willing to build games like this, but make more guarantees to their customers, or willing to take on more legal risk in order to encourage other people to start businesses who might not otherwise?
I'll just answer that quickly. Yeah, I do think that is happening actually now. And if you're enthusiastic about that, one of the things that you'll see is that just as contract can be used as a shield to insulate the company from liability, because they don't want to take the risk that all of the consumers are going to claim that they own virtual items, or that they have a real stake in the world. You can also pull it back and provide a certain level of guarantees to users if you think that that's going to lead to additional investments. But you better be prepared subsequently to answer those consumers if you have promised them that they have real stakes. And there's actually been cases about this. I talk about some of them in my book, where consumers have said, "You promised me a real stake in your platform, and now you're doing something that's inconsistent with that, and I'm going to sue because you're converting my virtual property," for instance. But I do think that would happen, just normal market development.
I want to add something to that as well. And so, I think I think increasingly you're going to see a sort of corporeal element entering into some of these games and the like, right? And so, as a person who studies robotics, we've actually, gotten away with a ton when it comes to computers and the internet, because all we're talking about is information here, right? And so, in the early days of computing, there would be some glitch where you lose some really important document. Maybe it was a spreadsheet with all of your clients on or something like that, and you go to the court and say, gosh, I relied upon this computer in it. And the court said, take a hike. You know what I mean? It's just a bunch of bits, a bunch of data, And they invoke things like the economic loss doctrine, which says that all you can really get is the cost of your software back or something like that. But to the extent that there's anything physical on the line, which again, I think increasingly is going to be the case. I mean, now you have it in terms of sensory input. You have people using Kinect. You have folks developing games that have sword fighting as a major component of it and the like. And I think soon enough you'll also have the delivery of physical results on the other side as well. That will no longer be possible. And so I don't necessarily share Greg's intuition that anything goes as long as it's in the terms of service. I think there's going to be limits to that. I mean, he obviously is the expert, but what I think is, I'm not second guessing you. I mean, you looked at the cases in great detail, but I think there are limits to that somehow, right?
It is.
Yeah.
I think there ought to be.
But there ought to be.
I mean, it is interesting that you propose as the games change, what happens? As you say, as the games start interacting with the physical world and affecting things in your environment.
Like a 3D printer, right? So you achieve a certain level and you get something physical as a result of it. Or you hurt yourself playing Wii, you know what I mean? Like all of a sudden, I'm not sure that those same terms of service, even if they said, this is a physically driven sort of exercise you're responsible for, I'm not sure that courts would end up upholding that ultimately. Anyway. Yeah, over here.
Thank you. You made a comment earlier that you've written a lot of pessimistic works and you want to write something more optimistic. I guess that maybe partly because, you said in a good plot you look for something that will really scare people. But, I think not just in your works, in other science fiction writers, I guess William Gibson, Margaret Atwood to name two, you really see this trend towards dystopian, pessimistic novels. Well, I guess I'm just curious, what will it take to write something more optimistic, and why don't we see more sort of optimistic, forward-looking plots?
Oh yeah, a big and interesting topic. It's a bunch of things. It's science fiction, I think, kind of jumped the shark at a certain point in being too optimistic. Sort of the picture of the future shown in sort of the original Star Trek was pretty sanitized, and people sensed at some level that was bogus. And so when people came along with darker visions of the future, Blade Runner, Alien, whatever, that felt a lot hipper, a lot cooler, and that kind of became the way to be for a long time. It's also, in a certain sense, an easier project to write a dystopian piece. If you look at, say, take the transistor, you look at everything that happened as the result of the transistor, that's a pretty big field, and so it's pretty intimidating right now to look at all of these technologies that could be at least as influential as the transistor, and try to imagine where all of that could lead. It's easier to say, well, there's a worldwide epidemic, only 5 people survive, and they have to make weapons out of car parts and kill zombies. That's a simpler project, and in some ways it's more entertaining. But the thing that we're working on now sort of came out of this. It's kind of an experiment, and it kind of came out of the idea that if all of our depictions of the future are dystopian, then what incentive do people have to build the future? And could that be related to the fact that it seems like there's been a big slowdown in our adoption of new, big, world-changing technologies? I mean, we've obviously a lot's been going on with mobile devices and the internet and biotech, but compared to sort of the difference between 1900 and 1967 in terms of our built environment. The difference between 1967 and now isn't that great. So what's going on? What's up with that? So Hieroglyph is a kind of experiment where we'll try to get a bunch of people to just write some stuff that's more in the vein of, let's build a jetpack and see where that leads us. The worst thing that could happen is that it'll be some entertaining stories and maybe it'll actually lead to some real world innovation.
I look forward to reading more like that.
And can I jump in on a kind of commentary on the question, or maybe also has something to say about my remarks? So, I'm coming again from a technologist perspective, particularly a security person's perspective, and the question was about, why are these, books all pessimistic? I'm probably not as well read as many of the people here, but one of the things that I believe is that technology brings many benefits, but if we think about security and privacy and all the other risks, I don't think that we as technologists know how to do it right in a way that doesn't actually have these risks. And so, my hypothesis is that if we try to create this fictional scenario in the future that has, that there is bound to be some sort of problem, simply because, again, we don't know enough about how to actually secure these technologies. And so, I guess maybe, so that's why it's.
Neal, I'll give you the first answer if you wanted.
Well, I was just going to mention I don't know if you followed the outing of Violent Acres on Reddit. So this is sort of capsule, of this whole issue. The Violent Acres is the username of a person on Reddit who's been posting a lot of kind of offensive content, and someone finally got fed up with him, figured out who he was, and published his real name. He lost his job. He's in a lot of trouble now. And so there's this huge controversy about it with sort of no one knows kind of what the right answer is. I mean, people feel they know the right answer, but there's a point of view that says anonymity is good. People should be allowed to be anonymous on the internet. That encourages freedom and so on. And there's another point of view that says it just leads to people behaving in reprehensible ways, and it's fine to out people who are behaving that way. So I think we don't have right now the vocabulary or the kind of structures in our heads to know what is the right answer. There's people on the internet now. There's sort of a big argument between Reddit and Gawker, the two sites that currently just hate each other on the internet over this one issue. And they're both sort of claiming to embody the ideals of pure, good, free internet behavior, and they've arrived at totally opposite conclusions, and they're sort of censoring each other and then attacking each other for being censors. Crazy situation.
Gosh, I have a far less interesting answer that I feel terrible about putting forward, but I was going to say that for all the sort of techno-pessimism that you might see in literature, and for all the thoughtful people like yourself who question whether we're able to build technology in a way that actually doesn't run afoul of these security and privacy issues, you'd be surprised how often technology is touted as the answer to some problem involving privacy, right? And how often companies, for instance, will say it's just a matter of changing the technology a little bit, or it's just a matter of people using privacy-enhancing technologies. I mean, technology ends up being what's supposed to be the solution in an incredible myriad of different areas. I mean, I don't know if you've seen those arguments as I have, but I mean, it's very common that people will believe, at least in the regulatory environment, that technology is going to be some panacea. Yep. Even so far as people not worrying about global warming, because we're just going to, create an umbrella, a giant umbrella that's going to protect us all, right? I mean, so it's like at the same time there's just a counter thrust, which is this techno-optimism that is so incredibly deep. Yeah. Okay, so we over here? Yeah.
I have a question about the creative process. This is mainly for Neal, but as far as everyone does creative work here, I'd like to hear your answers too. Do you have any thoughts about overcoming resistance? Like, did you have any writer's block while writing REAMD, and how did you overcome it? And as a related note, you may be aware of the work of Stephen Pressfield, The War of Art, and efforts like National Novel Writing Month to overcome resistance in general. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about the benefits of those activities.
Yeah, I'm not a big sufferer of writer's block, and I think it's almost a definitional question. I think when I think that a lot of people get hung up on the idea that it's an art and that it's kind of a mysterious thing. And that's an obstacle. That's a barrier. And where it's more of a craft, it's more like cabinet making. And so you don't hear of cabinet makers having cabinet making block. They might not have the right wood, or maybe their tool isn't sharp enough, but then they know how to address that problem. And so that's kind of my take on it. It probably sounds like a horrible thing to say for people who actually do have writer's block, but I just think that the idea of it as this mysterious art is it's setting people up for failure. And it's really about practice and just about doing it a lot. And so from that point of view, I'm totally in tune with the overall vibe of National Novel Writing Month, in that it's not wait for the muse to descend from heaven on a ray of light and give you perfect inspiration. It's November. It's November, right? Yeah. Get going. Write a novel. So I think that's a nice alternative approach to thinking about writing that I prefer to the kind of fine art mentality.
I'm a technologist and a scientist, and so I'm not asking this from the perspective of a Luddite, but it was helpful to me that this started talking about constraints, because really it sort of put the finger on how I feel about virtual environments. I really suspect that they're virtual prisons. And it's true they're freely chosen, but drugs are freely chosen, and they're heavily socially engineered by people that have a lot of social psychology technology behind them, and there's a lot of social influence that gets people in these addictive, closed environments that are controlled. They frighten me, and I think they might have something to do with the stagnation of change. And I believe, of course, it started with television and other virtual environments like that. And it concerns me, and also talking about terms of service really concerns me, because there's really no way to comprehend like all the end user license agreements that you have to face today. I put wiretaps on my computers to find out what they're doing, and I'm amazed at the information that they're giving away that I have absolutely no idea about. And I just think that to me, virtual environments really are constraints. But maybe you could speak to the freedoms of them.
So myself, I feel like I came to technology relatively late. I was like 22 or 23 years old before I became completely obsessed and hooked on it. And what I've seen, having been completely immersed in it for the last 18 years, is that there are aspects of technology that appeal to some aspect of technology that appeals very strongly to certain aspects of all of our characters. And those aspects of our characters very often are strongly drawn to that. And much as we give away data without realizing that we're giving away data, or that we are becoming heavily involved in technology in a way that is perhaps not mindful, we do have a responsibility towards ourselves to monitor that ourselves. I don't think that the gaming environment is so much engineered to be addictive as it is very appealing to a certain mindset that is drawn towards that environment and perhaps is willing to engineer their life around the game that they're playing instead of having the game being engineered towards pulling that person in an addictive and socially engineered way. So I think that just goes more towards intent and responsibility than it does anything else. I think we certainly see that there are people who spend their lives immersed in technology instead of having a life that is heavily involved in technology, which is maybe a little bit of a twitch there, but still kind of meaningful. And with the whole data thing, there's a massive amount of data that your computers do give up. And what I tell my friends and my kids is that read the terms of service, do track the data, do see all of those little add-ons and things that you install to make your computer run faster or to make the game more fun. See what it's doing. But at the end of the day, you installed it and you kind of need to own it because you took the action to bring it onto your computer. You took the action to sometimes run it onto the app. Read the terms of service, read the privacy statement, and kind of track the data. As you say, run wiretaps, run whatever kind of technology you need to see what those data flows look like. But it's something that we can all do.
A slightly different take, which is that I tend to agree that it would not be possible for even a person with a lot of training to determine exactly what's happening with their data just by reading privacy policies and terms of service. And in fact, there's been some pushback in recent years, for instance, by the Federal Trade Commission, where a company will technically disclose what it's doing somewhere in some document, but because of the invasive nature of the tracking, it will be determined not to be enough disclosure. And so, for instance, there's a consent decree with the company Sears of last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, but recently, where Sears was basically paying people money to download a particular kind of software onto their machine, and it was doing an incredibly invasive amount. I mean, it was looking at everything you were looking at, everything you were downloading, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And technically speaking, if you were to click through every single link, you would see everything that it's doing. But the Federal Trade Commission didn't think that was sufficient given just how invasive it was. And so I think there is a struggle between the tendency of companies, this is my own personal view, to be sort of as broad as possible in their disclosures. We track your internet history to do stuff, you know what I mean, that would never allow you as a non-specialist to get it. I do, though, share Bethan's idea about the fact that you need to take personal responsibility for how much you use, say, a game. And I don't know anything about internet addiction or gaming addiction. I don't know if something you looked at at all for purposes of your thing, but I think that for some small set of people it might be an issue. But I think you need to take responsibility for entering that engineered environment personally.
And if I could just clarify, there are certainly companies and applications that exploit. There are absolutely companies and applications that exploit. Like Sears made a massive mistake with how they handled that, in my opinion. Yeah. Companies have consistently, while they've been playing catch-up, they've made massive mistakes with how they handle data collection. So I'm not saying that all those people that, for instance, participated in the Sears study were at fault or were responsible, because there's no way that the average consumer can even understand how those data flows work. But when it comes to things that you participate in, like Halo, like your email, like social networking, those are conscious decisions that you're making with regard to how you're participating in those organizations.
I don't mean to, but just social psychology shows that really they're not necessarily conscious decisions, that you're making many actions whose drivers are not conscious. And nobody, even that's why there's double-blind research in science, because scientists will unintentionally influence their research, to the results they want without even knowing they're doing it. And I just suggest that there's a lot of possibility for this kind of effect in virtual environments.
Just jump in just to add. I think less than 1% of, there's a study that less than 1% of people actually read the terms of service. So, the extent that is our guiding, governance framework for our online lives, it's a pretty awful governance framework because we're not actually choosing to opt in, and they're written, I think, defensively by the companies. I think the only thing you can say for them is that they provide an incentive to actually, populate and create in this kind of new environment. And to tie it back to REAMD, I think there's a lot of discussion about Richard and the frontier and kind of, moving into new environments, colonizing new spaces. And to a certain extent, I think, this kind of new virtual realm where, a lot of things are kind of up in the air and there's a lot of, entrepreneurial activity is a stage that we go through, but then hopefully at some point we'll reach a place where the norms can be solidified and we can actually have a more stable system of expectations and laws around our virtual lives.
Of a building code.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I just assume that there's somebody like Bethan out there. Whenever I ignore one of those terms of service things, I just assume that Bethan is there reading it for me and that she's going to raise hell if there's any bad stuff in there.
I do that on a regular basis. I don't.
Thank you.
There's more of us every day. There's more of us all the time. So.
Please, yeah.
I want to know what you learned from going to China. I recently moved back from China, and I never got the sense that Big Brother was watching because I wasn't really sure that they could do anything with the data they were collecting. I did feel like any idea that was out there was going to be copied over and over again, whether it be a website or your clothing style or your name even.
Well, I think it's clear that at least at the level of internet filters, Big Brother's definitely watching. I mean, there's certain things that there was an event, what was the date of Tiananmen? It was like June 14th or something, June 19th. But anyway, the Shanghai Stock Exchange closed at 61,009 something. Anyway, the string of digits 619 or whatever the date of Tiananmen happened to occur in the closing stock market index, and it got automatically censored from the Chinese internet because they assumed that, or some bot assumed that anytime that series of digits occurred, it must be an illicit reference to Tiananmen. So there's that, and the other aspect that I think is pretty self-evident in China is just that even if it's not the sort of centralized Big Brother thing, it's just there's a lot of eyes on you at all times. If you're a Westerner, if you're anybody who looks the least bit conspicuous, you are being noticed, by a lot of people who are out in the street, kind of, and some of it's just passersby, just kind of spending the time of day, sipping tea, and in some cases it's cops, but it's definitely going on all the time, in my view.
Couple more questions, yeah?
Sometime in the recent past, I saw news about the production of a Snow Crash movie. Can you provide some insider details on that? And what is your personal attitude? Do you want to get involved in this, or do you have any feelings of fear that they will misrepresent the book, distort it in a completely different way?
Well, not too much, but here's one thought experiment that might be interesting. What if they do? So what? If the book were new, if the book had only come out a few weeks ago, then and then a big movie came out that somehow got it all wrong, then that could be a terrible thing for the book. But the book's been out for 20 years. 20 years, lots of people have read that book, right? And I think that the game changes the longer a book is out. Okay, I think there are cases of books that get sold, the film rights get sold before the book is even in print. And the movie is in production while the book is being read by people. And the movie can then become everyone's idea of what the book is. That's not the case with Snow Crash. It's not as though every copy of Snow Crash is going to be rounded up and pulped and expunged from the internet. It's just a new piece of art that's inspired by or based on the book. Having said that, the people that I've been working with for almost 20 years on this, there's a reason that I've stuck with them, which is that I think that they're going to do a good job. It would have been very easy to sell the thing to some random person, and that's not what we did. It's been the Kennedy Marshall Company all along, and that's a company that is run by people I know and trust, and it's a company that has got enough stability and standing in the world that they don't need to, there's no reason for them to go out and do something dumb. Right? They've got the time and the stature to sort of go about it in the right way. The person who's hopefully writing it and directing it, Joe Cornish, is an Englishman who did a movie called Attack the Block, which I recommend, and it's a movie that's I guess it's got funny stuff in it. So Joe has a sense of humor, and that's really crucial. It would be very easy to lose the humor in Snow Crash and just turn it into a bombastic, kind of loud, violent movie. And it may be all those things, but it's also going to be funny. And so that's a very important fact about it. Another important fact is that if the movie had been made in 1994, we would have had to explain the internet to everyone. There's this thing called the internet. Everyone can log on, and then you can sort of interact with other people who are logged on. You have avatars, and there would have been this enormous burden of exposition in which we tried to explain all these concepts to people that everyone now just knows. And that burden is now lifted. We don't have to explain any of that. Another interesting fact is that in the mid-1990s, we could have spent an infinite amount of money on computer graphics, and it still would have looked like crap 5 years later because it's changed so fast. Now it's so good that we could simply film all of the metaverse stuff live action, okay? And people would actually believe that it was computer generated, just because there's very little difference now between CGI and reality. So we don't have to deal with this burden of knowing that our CGI sequences are going to look ridiculous 5 years from now. So the time is right in a lot of ways, and the people who are doing it are the right people. I just think it's a perfectly reasonable moment to go ahead and do this and see where it goes.
Thank you for the very detailed answer.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't know if you heard George R.R. Martin on Wait, Don't Tell Me, and he was talking about how hard it was to film Game of Thrones because there's a tremendous amount of exposition.
Yeah.
And people don't want to sit through a lot of exposition, and so
they came up with a technique to deal with that problem.
Can you tell us about the technique that they?
I get to tell the story.
I'll, if you want. But I mean, basically, the technique that they came up with was called sex position, which is where if anyone's explaining any backstory, they're naked.
They're naked and having sex with another
probably
naked
having
person.
sex with another person, and that the more exposition you have to do, the nakeder and more. Anyway, all right. So we have time for a couple more questions here, and then we're going to wrap it up. Please.
Sure, I can follow the sex position. So I am a technology person. I was a computer science grad student here, and I'm a postdoc, and I've worked with Yoshi on security stuff. And the discussion earlier in the start of the panel, I was about how, in general, constraints in this book were really kind of had a lot to do with the plot in a lot of different ways, but also were kind of important to you as sort of a, I think you said this at least, that, it was important to you to get them right, sort of, because some other people don't. I wanted to ask both kind of you and the panel a bit about the flip side of this, which is things like in television today, at least at some point, maybe a year ago, most popular show on TV was NCIS, which is a crime drama take place in DC. And what strikes me about those shows, as a proud EFF member and privacy person, is that the plot of those shows is pretty much every episode the cops have to violate everyone's civil rights all the time, or else everyone in the country is going to die. And to me, this actually, I think this is not only sort of dishonest and poor writing, but I also think it's actually harmful to society, because we're sort of training people that this is the way that cops operate. This is the way that cops will have to operate forever. So I wanted to ask sort of both you and the panel whether you think that is true in any sense, and also whether you as an author, but also everyone else obviously has opinions about what we can do about this, how we can, as artists, sort of fight back against that kind of wave.
Well, you're asking the wrong guy at the wrong time, because just last night I watched, I think it was episode 9 or 10 of the 3rd season of Breaking Bad, where the two sort of meth cookers are trapped in their RV, which is a rolling meth lab, and the DEA agent is literally trying to pry the door open with a crowbar. And it's in the middle of a junkyard, and the junkyard owner comes up, and he just looks like this skanky, old, burned out junkyard owner, but he immediately begins to lay on this finely detailed legal analysis of what the cop is doing. and he says, this is private property, and what you're doing right now, clearly that door is locked, so you're doing breaking and entering. Do you have a warrant? And the cop says, no, but I have, probable cause. And the junkyard guy says, well, normally that would apply to a moving vehicle. This is not that. The cop says, you see these 4 round rubber things here? Those are wheels. This is a vehicle. And the junkyard guy is like, well, it looks like a domicile to me. And then the people inside the van start shouting, yes, this is my domicile, get away from my domicile. And it happens that the door, because of something that happened in the pilot episode, the door of this RV has bullet holes in it, which have been covered up with duct tape. So the cop starts peeling back the duct tape. So, oh, look, bullet holes, probable cause. And then the people in the RV are like, well, until you peeled off the duct tape, you couldn't see that they were bullet holes. And so you violated, my 4th Amendment rights by peeling the duct tape off. It had to be obvious, without, and so it turns into this big, finely divided legal argument, and it eventually succeeds in driving the DEA agent back. He has to go back to his car and get on the phone and call a judge to get a warrant, because he knows that none of what he's doing is going to stand up in court. And so this leads to the cookers eventually escaping. Sorry for the spoiler. But the very long-winded answer, but the answer is that as artists, the way that we combat this is by writing scenes like that, where the random skanky junkyard guy happens to know his rights and asserts them confidently.
But that only works because we have lovable criminals, right?
Well, I mean, it would work as well with, well, they're not actually that lovable. I mean, if you've seen they're highly ambiguous criminals. But I'm just saying that it's it's a complicated kind of marketplace of ideas, and some shows are going to espouse the position that you've described in the case of NCIS. And people who watch those shows may get the wrong idea, but there's a conflict going on. I don't think conflict is too strong a word between the people who write that show and the kind of people who write Breaking Bad.
All right, I think we have time for one more question here. Please.
My question's about games. ReamD has terrain, and you mentioned earlier, you talked about Dungeons and Dragons earlier, and you said something about the perfect game not having been invented. You also, in your book, talk about Go. I was wondering if you play Go. And as you research this book or otherwise, if you play any MMOs, and if you in fact do play Dungeons and Dragons, or used to.
Play D&D. I don't play Go. Every time I hear it mentioned, my face goes hot with shame because in Diamond Age, I made a terrible Go error. I confused it with a different game where you flip the pieces over.
Othello?
Yeah. I played. So I'm still getting polite but disappointed emails from Go. Actually, I think I fixed that error, but no, I don't. It looks way too difficult for me.
MMOs?
I played Warcraft for a while when I was working on the book, and then I stopped when I realized that at level 72 I was doing exactly the same thing as I had been doing at level 1.
What was your character in class?
A dwarf warrior.
Thank you. That answers my question.
On that, thank you very much, everybody. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much.